Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for joining us again for this session on clinical trials. We'd like to thank GSK for making this session possible. We are thrilled that Dr. Shannon Westin is here today to cover this important topic. Dr. Westin is Professor of Gynecologic Oncology in the Department of Gynecologic Oncology and Reproductive Medicine at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. She's on the board of directors for the Society of Gynecologic Oncology and the Gynecologic Oncology Group Foundation, and has previously served on the National Cancer Institute Uterine Task Force and Gynecologic Cancer Steering Committee. She is an expert on clinical trials, and we are grateful that she is joining us today.
Hello, everyone. I am Shannon Westin. I'm a professor and GYN oncologist at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. And it is my pleasure to take you over the next hour or so on a whirlwind tour of clinical trials. Okay, so I'm so happy to be here. These are my disclosures because I do clinical trials. I work with a lot of different companies. So what we're going to do is just go through some basics so that you can feel comfortable about what is a clinical trial. And I jokingly say, what's the anatomy of the clinical trial? We're going to talk a little bit about how drugs get developed. That's drug development, getting it to you. How do we get it from the lab all the way to you or your loved one? And then we'll do a quick primer on where to find a clinical trial. So how, if you're interested in clinical trials, what might be ways to find those? But the bottom line is research is important. Research cures cancer, right? So sometimes people feel like, oh, a clinical trial, I'm going to be a guinea pig and I don't want to participate. But I hope over the next hour to convince you that actually participating in research is absolutely in your best interest. And it's really going to help not only make a difference in the world, but also make a difference for you. Okay. And when we're talking about research, I'm going to focus mainly on therapeutics. So getting, again, drugs to patients, but you also have the basic science, the lab work that got understood the science to get it to us to where we could give it to patients, translational medicine, which happens during clinical trials where we take biopsies and blood work and then bring it back to understand why drugs worked for certain patients and didn't work for others. And then screening and prevention, of course, are so important. Let's prevent people from getting cancer, and then we don't have to do all this, and then I can go sit by the pool. So first, what's a clinical study? So this is the official from Sir Bradford Hill in 1962. Clinical trial is defined as carefully and ethically designed experiment in humans with the aim of answering some precisely framed question. But really, what does that mean? So this is going to be a study that involves patients. So volunteers are participating in this trial. The focus is to improve something, right? So either screening, prevention, or outcomes of people with a given disease. And I will let you know that even though it's a trial and it's new, it's really the end of the development. So if you look at, say, paclitaxel, which many of you may have received, that was discovered from this specific yew tree, which is what this picture is, back in 1967, and then went into trials in the 80s, and then became standard of care in the 90s. And so the people that participated on the trial in the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s had access to this new drug that became the standard of care. So when we're talking about the so-called anatomy of a clinical study, so of course there's the title, which is supposed to be as descriptive as possible to help people understand what it is we're looking at. We're going to have a list of investigators like myself, who wrote the trial, who has the trial open, what are the objectives for the trial, the endpoints. So this is what are our goals, right? And how are we going to measure those goals with those endpoints? The rationale, why are we doing it? We're not just doing it because we have access to two drugs. We're going to put them together and see what happens. Like, we've got science behind this that says that these two drugs will work better together than either one alone. And then, of course, who can go on it? What are the eligibility? And these aren't just randomly built. This is meant for safety and also for efficacy. So we are going to select people for whom we think this is going to be safe and that it's going to work. We have a design. How are we going to reach our endpoints? How are we going to reach our objectives? And then, of course, specific things like if you have a side effect, what do you do? How do you manage it? How do you change the way you're dosing the drug so that you can tolerate it? And then statistics. This is the science, the math, that's going to make sure that when we get to the end of the study, we can trust our results. So how many patients need to go on this study in order to get a valid and reproducible result? So where do we do trials? So the good news is it's anywhere now. Obviously, large cancer centers and university hospitals have done quite a bit, but clinical trials are open in the community as well. So in your local medical center or your physician's office, they often will participate in clinical trials. So the first thing to ask is, do you have access to clinical trials wherever you're getting your treatment? And then, of course, it's important to know who's supporting these. So who are the sponsors? So, of course, the National Cancer Institute, which is supported by the government, is certainly a very big sponsor of clinical trials, and specifically for GYN, NRG Oncology, where the G in NRG is the cooperative group that allows participation in research. There's also grants through the NCI that often support clinical trials, like SPORE grants, PPGs, R01s, R21s, a number of different letters and numbers. But the point is that the government is putting money towards clinical trials. We also see a lot of clinical trials supported by industry, right? So this is the companies that own the drugs are going to support the research to get it to patients. And then, of course, foundations. There are nonprofit foundations like the Foundation for Women's Cancer, OCRF, which may support clinical trials through grants. And then your local institution may also have the opportunity or may also support some of the clinical trials that are being done. So now that you know all that, let's talk about the different stages of clinical trials and where you might participate. So first, we have an idea, right? So we think of something that's really cool, and we take it into preclinical studies. And so that's studies in cell lines, in mice, and in little rabbits. And once we decide, okay, this does look interesting, then we take it into phase 1. Now, phase 1 is when we're looking at the best dose without toxicity. But I will say there's definitely this idea, well, phase 1, I don't want to do that because we don't even know if it works yet. But in fact, most phase 1 trials now are being done in a directed manner. So if you go on a phase 1 trial, you're going to go on a phase 1 trial that's been selected based on your tumor type or something in your tumor, some abnormality in your tumor that this drug targets. So you often have a better chance of efficacy with a phase 1 trial than you do with third, fourth, fifth line single agent chemotherapy. Once we know it's safe and we have a good dose, we move into phase 2, and that's really focusing more on efficacy. And sometimes you'll even see drugs go straight from phase 1 to phase 3, which is a larger study that's meant to compare to the standard of care to get FDA registration and get the drug to you. Okay, and of course, these phase 1, 2, 3s are in people. Now, we talked about the objectives. Those are our goals. And the endpoints are going to be our outcome. So what is the effect of our treatment? And is it doing what we want it to do? You know, the most common endpoints we see, of course, are survival and response. That's giving us an idea. Does the drug work, right? Do people live longer when we get it? Do people live longer without their cancer progressing? That's progression-free survival. Does it help shrink tumor? That's response. But we also want to look at things like symptom control. How do people feel on it? Toxicity. So does the drug help reduce symptoms from cancer? And then how much symptoms does the drug cause itself? So those are very important differences. We want to know how the drugs interact. And then, of course, how the drug is metabolized. So we look at things like pharmacokinetics, which is what does the body do to the drug. I'm going to show you survival curves. So this is a really important slide to understand when you're looking at the effects of a certain drug. When is it a positive? And so one of my mentors always used to say, and I love this, like it's the thumb rule. So each curve is a treatment. On this side, it's the probability that somebody is without recurrence. And this on the bottom here, the x-axis is time. So as time passes, how many people are still alive? Okay, does that make sense? Now, you want the curves to be spread, right? Because that means people are living longer with your new treatment, right? So the space between is the magnitude of benefit. It's often called the hazard ratio. And then you can, of course, you'll see a lot of times people talking about median values, like people lived a median of 12 months on this therapy. Now, that is a point estimate. So the medians matter, but so does the difference between the curves. And so if you can put your thumb in between those two curves, the thumb rule, then that is typically a pretty significant benefit. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more detail around these different phases. So first is preclinical. So this is before we're getting to patients. First, we start in cell lines, which means there's cancer cells, and we treat them with different treatments and see if they die in a petri dish. But you can imagine a petri dish doesn't really completely represent you, right? So then we try to go into animals to make sure, again, we want to test safety, we want to test efficacy in these animals, and then ultimately we will give it to patients. But importantly, we learn when we give it to patients, and then we may go back if we understand the mechanism better, and then go back and do different animal studies or different cell line studies in order to move that development even further. So this is a great example. So these are preclinical data from PARP inhibitors, which many of you may have heard of, right? So PARP inhibitors, originally, we thought they were going to be active in every single type of tumor, because they affected the way the cells repair their damage, right? So if you damage a cell, it repairs it through a specific pathway, and PARP acts on that. So stood to reason that it could potentially be very active across a number of things. But in fact, what we saw is the best activity was in patients or mice that had a BRCA mutation. So actually, it seemed that the efficacy and the activity would be more targeted. So this is where preclinical data can really help you and help you guide your trial development. So then once you identify that, you can move into a phase 1. Now, phase 1, the goal is, again, that toxicity, but we still are looking at efficacy. Generally, there's going to be a lot of phase 1 trials, lots of shots on goal, and they're usually fairly small. We use cohorts where we enroll 3, make sure that everyone's safe and doing well, and then enroll 3 more. So it's very stepwise and very careful in understanding the dosing and the side effects. So this was just an example of a study that I did combining a PARP inhibitor, olaparib, with a drug called AZD2014, which targeted a different pathway called PI3 kinase. And we thought the two would work really well together based on preclinical data we had developed. And so you can see we laid out doses, and we kind of go up. Each drug goes up in a stepwise fashion. We don't want to go right to max dosing because we don't want to make people sick. But as we moved through those cohorts, we could make sure it was safe and effective and try to get to the most biologically active dose. So once we do that and we've identified, okay, this is a safe drug, we know what the dosing is, then we move into phase 2, looking at efficacy. So that's how well does the drug work? Does it shrink tumors? Does it help people live longer? What are we looking for? In general, it's going to be a little bit more restrictive for eligibility, and you're going to enroll about 40 patients, maybe up to 60, depending. There are some that have multiple arms. That gets a little bit more complex, but the bottom line is you're trying to get a signal before you move to a larger study. So this is an example of a phase 2 study. This was study 19, where they took the PARP inhibitor olaparib in maintenance. And this was in recurrent disease. So patients had their cancer come back and were sensitive to platinum and had a response to their chemotherapy. They were then randomized. So like I said, phase 2s can be randomized, and either went on to olaparib as this pill maintenance, or onto a placebo. And the goal was progression-free survival, which is how long does a patient live before their cancer starts to grow. And, looks pretty beautiful, right? You could not just put a thumb here, you could drive a truck through that. That's a really nice benefit between olaparib and placebo. So this went on to a larger phase 3 study and became a standard of care. So let's talk about the phase 3. So these are typically randomized. So you have two arms at least, maybe even three or four. So randomization, I don't think I mentioned, you don't get to pick what arm you go on, right? So you agree to go on the trial and then the computer puts you on the arm of choice. So you may get the standard of care therapy or you may get the new therapy. It's going to be big. At least 200, sometimes over 1,000 patients on these. And typically it's going to be the goal of getting people the drug, so getting that FDA approval. So let's talk about a few randomized phase 3s. This was the Aurelia study. So this was done in platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. They had to have at least one therapy, but no more than two. And they were randomized to either non-platinum chemotherapy, and you can see in the little box on the right what the options were. It was either weekly paclitaxel, topotecan, or pegylated liposomal doxorubicin, Doxil. And they were randomized to either that chemo or that chemo plus bevacizumab. Bevacizumab is a drug that targets bad blood vessels. It's an anti-VEGF. And so it works really well on its own, but also it works well with chemo without a lot of overlapping toxicity. So they had done their phase 1. They had determined that this was safe and they could give a certain dose. And they had done a phase 2 to kind of get an idea. And so this was the opportunity to beat the standard of care, which is chemotherapy alone. And it did, right? Nice space between those survival curves. People lived longer without their cancer progressing on the combination of chemotherapy with bevacizumab, okay? And you can see the hazard ratio is 0.48. That means there was a reduction in the risk of progression of about 50%. So that's amazing and became a standard of care and became FDA approved. Here's some recent data. So this is mirvetuximab. And this is a drug called an antibody drug conjugate. These drugs are really cool. They basically work like a lock and key. So the cancer cells have a lock, and in this case, it's folate receptor alpha. The drug has a key, and when lock and key meets, the cancer cell absorbs the drug. It takes in the drug, and the drug releases a huge dose of chemotherapy, way, way higher than I could ever give you in your IV. And it kills the cancer cell and also a lot of the cancer cells around that one. So it's a super cool drug type. That's the antibody drug conjugate. Now, mirvetuximab basically targets that lock, that folate receptor alpha, and they had a phase 1 and a phase 2 and demonstrated a lot of efficacy. So reduction in tumor growth, as well as improvement in survival in early studies. So this was a randomized phase 3 study, Mirasol, where they were looking to confirm the benefit of mirvetuximab versus the standard of care, which again was investigators' choice chemotherapy, paclitaxel, pegylated liposomal doxorubicin, and topotecan. Now you might be saying, hey, Shannon, you just told me that those chemos should be given with bevacizumab, and you're right. So if you actually look in the enrollment, you can see that they wanted patients to have prior bevacizumab. That way, they had already gotten their chemo with their bevacizumab, and then we were moving on to just single agent chemotherapy. And what did they find? Well, a very clear benefit in progression-free survival. So about a 40% reduction in the risk of progression and an improvement in overall survival. People lived longer when they got mirvetuximab. This is the first time we've ever seen an overall survival benefit in platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. This trial was a really big deal. And so really exciting results, and that now you can get in your physician's office. And I show you this so you understand how much work it is, how much work goes into keeping you safe and getting you the best possible drug that works the best for you when you're getting treated in your physician's office. And to say, if you participated on the Mirasol trial or the Soraya study that was before it, you would have had early access to this drug. So really cool stuff. So I think I've been kind of espousing the benefits all throughout this talk, but let's just go through them. You get access to new drugs and interventions when you participate in studies. You also get really close monitoring. Usually you'll get like a direct line to a nurse or a clinical study coordinator that if you're having a problem, they're right there. And I'm not saying that your physician isn't right there too. I'm sure they are, just like I am. But there's something about having a direct line to somebody that really makes you feel safe. And there's standardized monitoring. So we are watching you closely, both from a side effect standpoint and also an efficacy standpoint. You're taking an active role in your healthcare. You are participating and making choices to help your own healthcare team. And you'll be potentially among the first to benefit. That's if it works, right? So there's no guarantees. But certainly if it's a good drug, you potentially can get early access. And it definitely can be better than what's already out there. The negatives, it can be hard, right? The logistics, there's usually a lot of testing, there's visits, and especially if you're looking at a clinical trial maybe away from home, right? So say you came to visit with me in Houston and I have a clinical trial for you, you might have to come back and forth to Houston, and you have to decide if that's going to be possible for you. Now, there is the risk of the unknown, right? So especially if you're participating on the early study, we generally will have an idea of the side effects that you might experience, but there may be some that we don't anticipate. And so just being aware of that. And of course, it may not work, right? Like I said, there's no guarantees. And so if the drug looks great and we think it's perfect, and then we get it into patients and, it didn't work. So that definitely can happen. But there's a lot of work that goes on beforehand to try to avoid that. So let's talk about sometimes high logistic things that don't work. So this was GOG 182. This was an upfront trial. So any patient with a stage 3 or 4 ovarian cancer that had surgery and was randomized, you can see they were really trying to see if there were other chemotherapy regimens other than paclitaxel and carboplatin, which has been the standard of care, that work better. Okay, so they looked at paclitaxel, carboplatin, gemcitabine, paclitaxel, carboplatin, followed by paclitaxel, carboplatin, and pegylated liposomal doxorubicin, topotecan, carboplatin, followed by paclitaxel, carboplatin, gemcitabine, carboplatin, followed by paclitaxel, carboplatin. I mean, just all the things in all the directions, in all the combinations. Everybody got 8 cycles of therapy. And they wanted to see if there was a difference. Now, what do you guys think? Can you put your thumb between any of those? No. So this is hundreds and hundreds of patients, and it was a negative study. Okay. But I will say that this was definitely back in the day where there wasn't a ton of new novel therapies, targeted therapies. This was just chemo A and chemo B and chemo C, chemo D, AB, BC. So now looking back, it's not that much of a surprise that this is the result we had. And going forward, we will avoid these types of things. So how do we help protect you, right? So you're hearing some of these risks, right? What's run through so that we can keep you safe? So the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB, and the Data Safety Monitoring Committee, the DSMC, these are 2 ways that the data are watched very closely. The IRB works early, looking at the trial ahead of time to make sure that it's written correctly, and safety is paramount. And then the Data Safety Monitoring Committee will look as the trial's running and make sure there's no signals that either, number 1, the trial's not safe, or number 2, that the drug doesn't work. So there's early opportunities to evaluate so that we don't treat thousands of people and it never worked. Of course, you're protected because your participation is voluntary. You don't have to do this, and you can leave anytime. You can withdraw anytime. The benefits are very clear. So the IRB will make sure that the benefits are not overstated, and that the benefits are clearly developed, but also that the risks and alternatives are very clearly developed. The cost to you will be described, compensation if you're getting paid for anything or supported for anything, and then of course the measures that protect your privacy and your confidentiality. Any new information that comes out during the study, like data from the Data Safety Monitoring Committee, will be disclosed. And again, that continuous monitoring of safety and efficacy is paramount. Of course, nothing's perfect, right? So there are barriers to us moving things forward. The expense, right? So research and development costs a lot of money. And you saw all these steps I just went through. Not every drug is going to make it to phase 3. And so all the money that was spent in that early development is lost, right? We know nationally funding's going down, right? So the government is not able to give as much money to fund research, and so that can really put up a barrier for us making progress. Of course, people not participating in clinical trials, and this is not just on you as a volunteer, but also on physicians that's not offering it, right? So making sure that we have clinical trial participation that is equitable and relevant and reflective of our population. And then, of course, there's many more negative than positive trials, right? We have a lot of I don't like to call them failures, but opportunities, and less successes. And so that can be a barrier to progress. There's a lot of disagreement about what's important, right? Does every drug have to make people live longer? Does it have to be overall survival? Or is it more important to balance that with living longer, but living better with good quality of life? So there's definitely a lot of discrepancies around or disagreements around that. And then, ovarian cancer is complex. It's not so simple, right? So, targeting one area that's important doesn't always give us the impact that we would hope. But what's good about it is we know that when we have a drug on the market, it's been very, very well vetted, and we can feel confident and comfortable that the drugs that are being offered to us as standard of care are the best possible things we could get. So when can you participate? Well, the bottom line is anytime, right? So there are trials when you're first diagnosed that could involve surgery or new chemos or modification of improved therapy. Or you can participate when your cancer comes back. So there's determination of whether or not your tumor might be sensitive to platinum or resistant. And, it'll all depend on how many treatments you've received and what opportunities there are. And then, of course, you can always participate in when conventional treatments have failed. And that's often when we use phase one, although, like I said, phase one studies are moving earlier and earlier in our treatment continuum because they're so targeted that if you have an abnormality in your tumor and we can target it, that may be much better than us just giving you this standard of care chemotherapy. And this just walks you through kind of like a way to look at how we develop these novel therapeutics and getting an idea of what I'm talking about these targets. So for example, when we target abnormal blood supply, this is what happens, right? So you have a normal cell, something happens to it, something in the environment, UV rays, whatever. And then it becomes abnormal. Then it starts growing out of control. And it starts pulling in all these new blood vessels. It's called angiogenesis. And so here are places that we can target, right? So we can target blocking the environmental pressures. We can target the uncontrolled growth. We can target the invasion. So there's all sorts of cool places where we can potentially put a drug in there to stop it. And then, of course, I always have a few slides on immunotherapy because everyone always is asking about it because the commercials are everywhere, right? So immunotherapy is basically when we take your body's immune system to fight the cancer. So you get a drug that stimulates the body's immune system. And the most common are what are called checkpoint inhibitors. And so PD-1 and PD-L1 is one of the kind of places where the tumor and the immune system interact. And so if we can block that, and when that happens, when the tumor hits the immune system, it shuts it down. It says, oh, just go to sleep. Go lay down. You don't need to fight me. I'm good. And it makes the immune system ignore the cancer. So by blocking that interaction, then we kind of take the brakes off your immune system and allow your immune cells to fight your cancer. For ovarian cancer to date, hasn't been as good as we'd hoped. Ovarian cancers are very good at hiding from the immune system. It's called immune evasion. And so with that, we're still doing a lot of research to try to help push the envelope here and help immunotherapy work better for ovarian cancer. Oops. So we're going in a lot of different directions. And I'm not going to spend too much time here, but, patient selection is huge now. And so it used to be every trial was done in every patient, right? Like that 5-arm chemotherapy trial. Now we're not doing that. We're binning people based on their histology, based on abnormalities in their tumor. And we're also looking early at mechanisms to try to understand if it's working or not, right? So looking at blood markers, tissue markers, even breath markers to try to understand, is this working for you or should you come off trial? All right, doing okay? We got about 5-10 more minutes, and this is going to be very practical. So there's a lot of resources out there. I don't have the time nor the bandwidth to go through every single one, but I'm going to take you through a couple that I find to be extremely helpful. Okay. So the first is clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov, you just put it in your little web. There are hundreds and hundreds of trials that are ongoing. And it can be super overwhelming, but let me show you kind of how you might move through. All right. So when you first click and you put in, here we go. When you go into your search, you can put in ovarian cancer. Okay. So let's say we just did that and you have all studies. Okay. So you hit your little search button. Oh, I have a little red line, ovarian cancer. And this is what you find. Yikes. You found 4,329 studies. A lot of studies, probably a lot to kind of hop through every time. So there's a way to continue to focus, right? So you say you put in your ovarian cancer. Well, you could also put in other terms, right? So you could say, I'm interested in PARP inhibitors or mirvetuximab or what have you. So let's do that. So first, we're going to click who's looking for participants, right? Because the idea is, I want to go on this trial right now. So you don't want people that are done. You don't want people that are going to be happening soon. You want trials that are recruiting now. Okay. So you click that. You can also click the type of trial, right? So if you're not, if you're interested in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, perfect. Or just phase 1 or phase 2, whatever works for you. But you can basically kind of filter those down. Okay. You want to click interventional. Somebody's giving you something. Okay. So these are ways to kind of reduce these numbers. Okay. You also can put in other specific things, the title, if you know what you're looking for, or the drug, or, oh, I heard AstraZeneca has something. Like, you can do those things. And when you do click those things, then you get to a more workable, still 416 studies, but it's not quite as bad. And so you can see that you get a list of these studies here. Okay. Now, what if you even want to get more specific? Okay. So if you focused, you did phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you did interventional, you did ovarian cancer, you can also add in a specific drug, right? So say that we wanted to see, are there any studies with mirvetuximab? Oh, now I have 7 studies. Well, that's kind of cool. Like, that's really workable. So you get this list, and it's like a little laundry list, a little table. And so you can click on one, right? So we're going to click on this one. So evaluation of maintenance therapy combination with mirvetuximab and olaparib. Okay, so that's your title. And you can see the sponsor is University of Colorado. Okay. And so you can click on this study. And it's going to give you a little overview. Okay, so they think that the combination of mirvetuximab and olaparib is going to be a really nice maintenance strategy. This is for platinum-sensitive recurrent ovarian cancer. Okay, cool. That looks good. And then you can see that the conditions, ovarian, peritoneal, fallopian tube, and what the 2 interventions are. You can see on the right here when it started. So it's just starting. And then when it's thought to be completed, and how many people they're going to put on there, 53. Okay, cool. Now you can also, there's more detail over here. All of these are little links that you can click to get more information. So if you're intrigued by this, you can say, okay, I want to know how I could go on. So that's your contacts and locations. Look at that. You have a name. You can call Samantha Hop and say, hey, I'm interested in this. Now, if this was open at more than one place, you would see a list of things. So this is just open at University of Colorado. But if it was, say, open at 20 hospitals, all those hospitals would be listed right here. In addition, you can get more detail about the collaborator. So you can see, okay, the principal investigator is here. It's Bradley Core, perfect. And it's sponsored by Immunogen, which is the company that markets the mirvetuximab. Are there other sources? Yeah, of course. So I like the Foundation for Women's Cancer. One, it's a great resource for all sorts of things. So this is, if you haven't looked at this particular website, I definitely would. They've got, if you click on the gynecologic cancers, they have detailed information about all of the different cancers, ovarian, uterine, cervical, and they'll have information that's written for you, kind of your level, what you need. But their clinical trial search is also really cool. So you could click on this little clinical trial button and it pops up this. So clinical trial basics, that's an area that basically has a text version of the lecture I just gave. So giving you some basic information around how to get involved with a clinical trial, what you need to do, logistics, things like that. But if we want to find a clinical trial, we can do that. Now, interestingly, this is new because I always update these talks when I give them. It used to be that they just used this emerging med, which is what I'm going to show you, but it also could take you back to clinicaltrials.gov. So these are very, I think it makes it a more balanced website. So you can go right here and say, okay, I'm going to look here, I'm going to look there. Now, emerging med's kind of cool because it has a few little different features that I like. So let's say we're going to click that. And this is the navigation, okay? So you can say, rather than clinicaltrials.gov, where you kind of put in ovarian cancer, maybe you put in a specific drug or the phase, this actually, you can fill out a questionnaire. So it'll ask for your diagnosis, your stage, your treatment history, and it's all kept confidential, but they basically try to match you to a trial without you having to do the work. So it's pretty cool opportunity. Or you can actually just say, I don't want to get online and do all that. Can someone just call me? And so you can request a contact where you put in your phone number, your email or whatever, and one of the clinical trial navigators will reach out to you, again, get your diagnosis, treatment history, and everything else, and then actually call you like, hey, we've got a match for you. So it's kind of a neat free service where they really look out for you and help you identify. Now, your doctor can do this, but sometimes it's hard to keep up with everything. And so it's nice, these kind of services are nice where it kind of takes it out of a busy clinician's hands, takes it out of your hands where you're trying to interpret all of these things and helps you find it. Now, I'm going to focus in a little bit because I want you to see on this right side. So here's where you could actually just search by trial. So we talked about the navigator and getting contacted, which is really cool. But you also can take matters into your own hands. Again, so you can select your therapeutic area, which is cancer treatment, adults, and then pick the diagnosis, ovarian cancer. And you can even put in your zip code if you want to try to say, okay, well, I live here and it would be great to have something nearby. That filter, it won't take things away that aren't, but it'll just tell you, okay, that's 500 miles away. But you can put in those things and then you get to see your list. And you get a pretty extensive list. And you can, like I said, if you filter it by location, like, oh, okay, I could totally go on that. That's in Houston. I live in Houston and look at this option I have right here. And so you then basically can, either ask, again, request a contact to help you move through all this, or you can click on something that sounds interesting. So let's click on Duo O. And here it gives you more information. Okay, this is a phase 3 study. It has a bunch of different interventions. It's chemo, immunotherapy, and a monoclonal antibody, which is just a targeted therapy. Cool. Okay. And it gives you the NCT number. And if you click on that, it'll take you over to clinicaltrials.gov, your diagnosis, ovarian cancer, the targets. So if you know what targets your tumor has, you can say, oh yeah, I have B7H1. And you can get pre-screened. So you can click this little pre-screen button. Again, you'll fill out a short questionnaire, determine if this matches you, and again, request a contact, like have somebody from the trial reach out to you and talk you through it and see if that's an option. So this is a pretty cool search function. And I think a little bit more patient friendly than clinicaltrials.gov, but still has a wealth of information. So with that, I would just thank you all so much for your attention. I hope that you learned a ton. Definitely reach out anytime. And I'm happy to get you in to see me and talk you through the clinical trial opportunities that we have at MD Anderson. But otherwise, I wish you well, and I hope you're having a great meeting.